Dr. Stephen Hussey jumps on here to help me understand a little bit more about what's referred to as metabolic water, easy water, and his experience with cardiac issues, both personal and professional, as a doctor, are some things that we can take a lot from. So enjoy this conversation as we bring together the quantum with the practical in a really enlightening conversation. Dr. Hussey, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. You have, a really interesting backstory with the type 1 diabetes and the cardiac issues, as well as your personal experience as a chiropractor and taking in this research into a really, really cool level that ties into all the quantum aspects that we've been in quite a bit. So if you will, just give us that brief little introduction to who you are and how you got into having what I think is about to be a really cool conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I guess my interest in health stemmed from my own health issues as a kid. I had a lot of, I would say, chronic inflammatory things as a child. Everything from asthma to allergies to irritable bowel syndrome. I used to break out in hives all over my body, just giant hives. And the doctors didn't really know what to tell me it was. They were just like, "Oh, take this Zyrtec or take this prednisone or whatever." Ultimately ended up with type 1 diabetes at age 9 as a result of all that inflammation. My parents and I were just kind of reliant on Western medicine to help us manage these things or give us answers or lack thereof. And it wasn't until probably college that I figured out that I could change the way I live my life, and a lot of these things went away. And most all of them have gone away now, aside from the type 1 diabetes. The damage was done at that point, and those cells don't make insulin anymore. So yeah, but I thought it was interesting that no doctor had ever told me, hey, you could eat different, or you could exercise, or you could do different things, and it would have an effect on these conditions. And so that kind of sparked my curiosity. It kind of led me more to going more chiropractic rather than medical school, because I had wanted to be like a pediatric endocrinologist. But I just kind of disillusioned with that system and that way of thinking. And it didn't give me answers. So I was like, well, I want to learn something different. And I've always just been very curious since then. And my dad taught me curiosity. He was always very much like, we'd say, oh, that's the way it is. And he'd be like, but why? And we'd have to answer why. And then he'd tell us why and that kind of stuff. So it's just been this never ending journey of trying to find the answers of, why I got sick, why the population is so sick, how life works, and eventually that leads you to studying life and how life came about on this earth. And because you understand that, you understand how to sustain life. And it's all about energetics and things like that. So it's led me down all these rabbit holes. And I also had, I guess, the benefit of, having no preconceived notions, no, dogmatic training in something. I was just like, I'll just read anything. And sometimes it didn't make sense at all, what I was reading, or I was like, oh, that's not true. That can't be, or whatever. But then I'd read, a few things down the road, a year later and be like, oh, maybe that thing I read was accurate. Maybe there's something to that. So I'd go back to that and just kind of investigate. So that led me down all these rabbit holes of food and metabolic health and light and structured water and all this stuff, and then I specifically had an interest in heart disease because I was told throughout my childhood that type 1 diabetes heavily predisposes you to heart disease. And I was always pretty good about, my diet ever since college, as far as the whole foods diet and things like that. And that's something that I can really control. But there's way more to heart disease than just diet, which it's kind of one of my big messages to people, is that people think it's about what diet you eat. And that can contribute or help with things, but it's way more than diet. And I would say that diet's a small part of what helps you prevent heart disease, or can contribute to it if it's the wrong diet. And so, yeah, despite my best efforts of controlling my diet, I had a heart attack at the age of 34. And, you know, my people will say, oh, well, were you more overweight? No, I looked exactly like I do now. Always fit, healthy, having type 1 diabetes. I went through a lot of stress, probably one of the most stressful times in my life. Prior to that, got some of the most stressful news in my life a day and a half before it happened. I was not doing a lot of the things that I do now concerning light and circadian rhythm and things like that. And so yeah, it was kind of this a little bit of an eye opener. But you know, it's seen as this bad thing, and like a heart attack, and it is. I wish it didn't happen, but it did, and it has opened up curiosity to me. It's opened up new avenues for me. There are people that, based on the knowledge that I have and the experiences that I've had, like a heart attack, that now want to talk to me, and I can help them. And so it's interesting that it opened up those types of things. My heart's completely recovered. I'm 100% healthy, which I did without any medications or any of the recommendations pretty much that they recommended to me in the hospital. And I'm not saying that's the right, you know, avenue for everybody, but I definitely did it without those things. And they were kind of shocked that my heart fully recovered within 3 months. And so, yeah, it's kind of my story. And now I'm just kind of sharing, you know, my information with people, hoping that it helps them. I seek to understand and to try and understand like why these things help us be healthy, why these certain stimuli. And so as much as I can help people understand that, you know, the healthier the world will be. So, yeah.
I love it. I love a lot of things that you just said there that really resonate with, you know, our story of like, I wish, you know, my son never got cancer, but we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation, wouldn't be able to help people and learn and dive in. And so I remember early on thinking that diet was absolutely the most important thing and being very frustrated with the oncology and medical advice on where they basically say it's not, and then it's counter, right? And so read the China study, dove into the plant-based side of things, then somehow got a hold of Ken Berry's book, and I was like, just the cognitive dissonance, I couldn't do it at the time, right? And I just said, I just got to table that, and just kept going. And the information being so extreme, so polarized against carnivore, vegan, keto, you know, the mainstream of eat whatever you want, right? Or saturated fat is bad. Seeing the disconnect, I just didn't really understand why certain things would work for certain people and not. And then, you know, got punched in the face by Jack Kruse and his work and just made me just like question everything, right? So you had mentioned light a few times and the circadian aspect and how nutrition may not be one of the most important factors with cardiac disease. And I want to dive into that. I want to dive into that light aspect and what you've said about going deeper. And then you've got a whole body of work around water, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. So let's go into the metabolic water, also called, you know, easy water, structured water, a lot of that, because there's still a lot of disagreements, I think, in that realm, right? And how it's directly tied to light. So what is metabolic water? What is easy water?
Yeah. So, I guess, I mean, the first way to say it is that water is water, but it exists in these three states that we're told, you know, in school. There's solid, liquid, gas. There's steam, there's ice, and there's water, liquid water. But it actually can exist in a fourth state. It's been called the fourth phase of water. It's been called exclusion zone water, structured water, bound water. And it's basically just like we know that liquid water can, you know, freeze and become this hard thing called ice. Water can also become more of a gel-like substance. And when I say gel, you can kind of think Jello, or when a bone broth kind of congeals when you put it in the fridge, or like consistency of raw egg white, that kind of gel consistency. And so water can exist in this state, and it needs a few things to do that. And, you know, people have told me doubters have told me like, oh yeah, this is not true science, blah, blah, blah. But you just got to look at the work of Gerald Pollack and the many people before him, Gilbert Ling, James Clegg, Maywan Ho, Jim Oshman, Albert St. Georgi, all these different scientists that if you start reading their work, many scientists have come across this phenomenon in their work, and they've called it different things in the literature. They've called it all kinds of different names because they were all discovering it at different times, and they just called it different things. But Gerald Pollack is the one that has kind of popularized it and brought it to the masses because of his book, The Fourth Phase of Water. But, you know, for the other doubters out there, most of the water in my body is in this gel state. And all you got to do is poke yourself in the face. Like, that's a gel. You know, it gives because of my pressure and it bounces right back. Same with the tissue of my forearm. If I just do this, like it gives and bounces right back. That's a gel. It's not a water bed. It's not like I'm squashing around like a water bed, you know, liquids moving. And we're all told we're a large percentage water. And so this structured water needs a few things to form. It needs water, obviously, and the water needs to be kind of free of toxins, and it needs to be mineral rich. And then we need energy source, infrared energy, which, you know, up to 50% of the sun's rays are infrared of all times. So that makes sense evolutionarily, that here we are in this world that's getting energy from light. And that's why it makes sense. And then we need a what's called a hydrophilic surface, or a water loving surface. So you can get a hydrophobic thing, like fat is hydrophobic. That's why when you put little fat droplets in water, they kind of sequester themselves away from the water. You know, they don't emulsify into it. And then hydrophilic is something that's water loving. So when water gets next to a hydrophilic surface and that's energized enough, it will structure itself into this gel state. And they've shown this over and over again in Dr. Pollack's lab. And it does this in many places in the body. It does it in the cells. All cells are supposed to have almost completely structured water in them. But there are little liquid water channels between structured water and cells. And so when it comes to the vascular system, which is kind of something that I've, delved pretty deep into, there's liquid water in the body too. And there's liquid water in the blood. There's liquid water in the lymphatic system. There's liquid water in the cerebral spinal fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. But that water, given the right stimuli, can also structure itself onto the lining of those things. And this becomes very relevant for explaining lots of the things we see in physiology. And, we live on the water planet. We are told we are a large percentage water. So it makes sense that we should know the properties of this thing that makes up our planet and makes up ourselves. And when we start to study it, and you can think of it more as biophysics, we start to get a lot of answers about physiology and life and things like that. So given that explanation of this water, we can go where you want to go with it, as far as using it to explain health or disease or whatever.
Let's go into the mitochondria. Let's discuss the byproducts, because what we're taught is it produces ATP. That's the energy of the body, right? And there's so much more to it, right? And so if the mitochondria are producing CO2, water, metabolic water, structured water, and heat or infrared light, I think that's an extremely important concept to say, hey, there's more than just the ATP conversation. So can you go through that the mitochondria is producing those things, especially the metabolic water?
Yeah. So the mitochondria, just kind of the backstory of it is that, the theory is that it used to be a separate bacteria living on its own way back in the day, before complex life had formed. And so at that time, oxygen was growing in the atmosphere because of changes that were happening on the planet. And so these bacteria, these mitochondria, or that would become mitochondria, were really good at using oxygen. And the cells that we think of as our cells were separate from them, and they weren't as great at utilizing oxygen. And so these two kind of teamed up somehow. And the mitochondria, the bacteria that became mitochondria, kind of teamed up with these cells, and now they could do the job of utilizing oxygen to do things, to create energy, so to speak, or to harvest energy and use it for what it needed. And then the bigger cell that we think of as our cells could then not have to focus so much on utilizing oxygen or increasing utilization of oxygen. Now they could focus on building much more complex multicellular beings, right? And building and maintaining cells and that kind of stuff. So it was kind of this partnership that paid off and has stood the test of time. That's what we see today. And so what a mitochondria does is it takes energy in the form of electrons and it passes them, and we can harvest those electrons from food, which is what we think of like when every medical student studies the Krebs cycle and glycolysis and all these things. We're studying the process of harvesting the chemical bonds from food and grabbing electrons from them. And those electrons are used to pass down the electron transport chain, which is something in the mitochondria. But you can get electrons from many places. You can get electrons by generating a piezoelectric effect by moving the fascia in your body. You can generate electrons from sunlight hitting your skin. You can absorb electrons directly from the surface of the earth. And life is all about absorbing electrons, absorbing energy in many different ways, and using that energy to maintain order. And order is what we know of as health, as life. And then, the second law of thermodynamics of the universe is that things tend toward disorder. And if things become disordered because we're not good at harvesting energy and creating order, then we get disease. And so when someone has disease, it's their body unable to harvest energy and utilize it to maintain order, and they start to break down. So the mitochondria are the little, microscopic things in our cells that allow us to utilize that energy. But what they do exactly in a cell is misunderstood, in my opinion. It's thought that, at least, medical students, any biochemistry student is taught that those electrons, we're taught that we can only get them from food, and they're taught that those electrons are used to make ATP. That's the end game. We want to make adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the cell. And, it does, have a chemical bond, a phosphate bond that stores energy. But it's used for something very different than fueling cellular processes. And Gilbert Ling has proven this very eloquently in his books, that the amount of ATP that we need to run a cell far surpasses the amount that our mitochondria could produce. So there must be something else going on. And so, yeah, like you mentioned, our mitochondria, when they pass those electrons down, they're making carbon dioxide, they're making water, they're making heat, and they're making ATP. And all those other things besides ATP are not just irrelevant. Mitochondria are making the perfect energized, deuterium depleted, structured water for your cell. And that's one of their jobs. They're also making infrared heat, which is like we said, infrared is the most structuring to water, the most energizing to water, so that when it gets next to a hydrophilic surface, it can structure itself. And so then the CO2, and people think, CO2 is a bad thing, we got to get it out of us, but it's actually driving oxygen utilization. So if we don't have enough CO2, then the drive for oxygen is not going to be huge, and we're not going to absorb as much oxygen, which means mitochondria are not going to work as well. So there's that, and then there's the ATP at the end. And so when we talk about structured water and we talk about needing hydrophilic surfaces for structured water to form, if most of the cell is structured water, is made up of this structured water with a little liquid water channels in between it so that things can pass through it, then we have to ask ourselves, where does that surface area come from for the cell? Like we have this big, spherical thing of a cell, or somewhat spherical thing. Where's the surface area? And it's the proteins in the cell. It's the kind of the cytoskeleton, kind of the scaffolding within the cell. And that's made up of microtubules of collagen protein. And this collagen protein doesn't just exist in the cell. It's actually connected outside the cell, and it's what holds us all together. It's for like a very macro stance. You can look at the fascia in your skin. For a micro stance, it's the microtubercular lattice in the cell. And so These proteins usually come folded up on each other. And when they're folded up, they're kind of like a big ball. So you can think of it like a ball of aluminum foil. If you ball it up like that, there's much less surface area around that ball. But if you open it up and you flatten it out, you create a lot more surface area on the front and the back of that aluminum foil. So if we unfold proteins, that creates a lot of surface area for a lot of hydrophilic surfaces for structured water to structure itself on and become this gel water. And so that's the job of ATP. It unfolds proteins in the cell. Okay. And so, yeah, that's what maintains this cellular function. And so there's a few things that structured water does for us. It provides the structure of the cell. It provides a medium through which the cell can perform its operations, like it provides the structure needed for like when a cell divides, and so the things moving through the cell in order for it to divide, it creates kind of this gel that happens in, and it creates that structure. It also is what creates the cell's net negative charge. So every medical student or again physiology student is taught that the cell holds a net negative charge. I think it's like negative 45 or negative 25 to 45, somewhere in there. And that's when the cell operates at its best, is when it holds this net negative charge. Well, guess what? Structured water is very electronegatively charged because of the way that it forms, because of the way that it splits the water molecule and combines the oxygen and hydrogen left off. Oxygen is a bigger molecule, and so it's more negatively charged, and the polarization of water is kind of destroyed in that point. So we have a very electronegative space. It also because of the way that happens, because that negatively charged structured water happens, and then the other hydrogen that's cleaved off of water is pushed out into the space next to the structured water, that creates a positive next to a negative, which creates a battery. We all know that when we put a battery in something, we have to align the positive and negatives. And so that actually creates energy. And they've actually shown in Dr. Pollack's lab, you can stick an electrode into the structured water and into the bulk water next to it, which are positive and negative, and you can power a light bulb with it. So it creates energy. So that creates energy for a lot of different things. It's what holds the negative charge of the cells, which they operate at best, that action potential that, when the cell fluctuates. And Dr. Pollack wrote an amazing book called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life that explains a lot of that, about how what we see as an action potential is actually a phase transition of structured water going away and coming back. And that's what provides this stimulus for some change or action or physiology to happen in the body. It's all explained by structured water. So it's very, very important for our cells. And when it starts to break down in certain areas of the body, it can explain a lot of disease processes that we see.
So that negative charge you're talking about, simply that's the redox state, right? And so there's a huge tie in there with cancer, and I found it fascinating that it all goes back to this mitochondrial conversation, right? When you were going through the electron transport chain, can you break in a little more of that? Because you hit on it a little bit, but at hydrogen, right, we're breaking into 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, and hydrogen is a proton and electron. That's what's feeding the electron transport chain. I think a lot of times we get broken away from that the hydrogen electron proton disconnect there, which, if we are separating it, and I want you to go into this, because I think this is where you're headed next. With the light piece, and we have melanin separates water for us to provide hydrogen to the electron transport chain, to the mitochondria. So go through that process, how light is so unbelievably important, which goes into you'd mentioned the deuterium depleted aspect, but go into that light and the separating of hydrogen and oxygen to feed the mitochondria.
Yeah. I'm going to preface that with something, because it's important to understand. Especially for people who are, classically trained in what medical students would go through, or any physiology would go through, or anybody learning physiology. We learn, this is how the electron transport train works. We learn these steps, we learn this biochemistry. But we have to step back and say that may not be exactly how it works. As far as the certain steps that we've learned, or just what we even think things look like down there. And the reason being is that there's a fascinating book by a guy named Harold Hillman, and he has a co-author too, but I can't remember his name. And I forget what the book's called actually. It's basically him. He's a scientist, and he's going through and he's saying, like, if we want to study something, then we have to be careful that in the process of studying it, we haven't changed the thing itself, which is very important information to have, which, if you think about it, makes it almost impossible to study anything really without changing it. Because even if I want to go sit in the woods and just observe something and study it, my presence in the woods may be changing what it's doing. And so if you look at the process by which scientists have determined how mitochondria work and how cells work, it makes absolutely no sense. When you take cells out of their host and you kill them, you freeze them, you stain them, sometimes they eliminate all other things by applying an antibiotic, and they put it in a blender and slice it up so you get a cross section. They put that on a slide and they shine a light onto it, and you say, okay, this is what a cell looks like. I don't know. That's what a cell that's been sliced up and stained and frozen and all this stuff, that's what that looks like. And Hillman brilliantly makes the argument that most of the things that we think exist in cells are actually artifacts that we've created in the process of preparing that cell for study. And it's fascinating. It's enough evidence to me to say, okay, well, we really don't know. And so the only real way that we should be studying cells, or the way that we can change things, or I guess understand things, is if we look at whole living cells, right, under a microscope, which people can do. You can do that, but it's hard to get in there and see. But when you look at a whole living cell from the outside, the only things that we see are a nucleus, nucleolus, mitochondria, a cytoskeleton, and a singular cell membrane, not a bilayer. So we have to assume that those things, using those things, we can explain cellular function. And so it makes me call into question lots of things, like that there's an inner and outer mitochondrial membrane. I don't know for sure. All I know is that the body has wisdom, and if we apply it into the right environments, which are the environments that humans have been in for most of the time that humans have been on Earth, however long you believe that is, then, and we put it in that environment, it knows what to do. And so when you say things like, the sunlight hits melanin, and melanin dissociates water. And we know that, for this electron transport chain to work, we need electrons, we need hydrogen, because hydrogen is pumped into one side. Electrons are passing down one way, and protons of hydrogen are going the other way. And that's an electromagnetic field. That's what it creates. We know that, and it creates water. Then when sunlight hits melanin, it creates water. And so that's the things, or it doesn't create water, it creates electrons, protons in the form of hydrogen, and then oxygen. So those are the three things that we know mitochondria need. So sunlight hits melanin, and melanin is not just this thing that pigments your skin or tones your skin. It's concentrated everywhere in the body. Many different places that people are like, well, why is it there? It's in the back of your eye, it's in your nervous system, it's in so many places, and it's in all these places in nature. Anywhere you see, darkness, like the bark of a tree, or dark skin or dark hair on an animal, like it's all melanin. Life is just incredibly set up to harvest energy from the sun. And so when those things happen, when light hits our skin, DHA can make electrons, melanin can make oxygen, hydrogen, and electrons. And all those things are utilized by mitochondria to do the process that we think we understand at the mitochondrial level of electron transport and making of infrared heat and light, so to speak, even though it's not visible light, and water and CO2 and ATP. And then those things do what they're supposed to do in a cell. And we get this cell that functions like it's supposed to, using the only things that we truly know are in a cell, which are the things that I listed you can observe from outside the cell. Those are the things you can see. And that's kind of the wisdom there, and you can get into details and you can get into all these different kind of back and forth arguments about what exists and doesn't exist. But it's just like, at some point I've come to the conclusion that the details of those things we may never fully understand. And trying to study them has gotten in the way, I think, because then, every time I hear somebody or see somebody on a comment say like, where's the human studies on that? Do you have the research on that? And it's just like, yeah, research is not, I read a ton of research and I like to read it. But I recognize the shortcomings of it. And I recognize that it was designed by humans and that we've messed with whatever reality there is there just in the process of studying it. And I just kind of default to, okay, well, where did humans thrive? Like, in order to get to the point where humans are today, we had to thrive. We didn't just survive. We had to thrive. And so that means that the environment that we're in, as harsh as it may have been, because nature can be harsh, we still thrived to the point where we got to where we are today, and to the numbers that we are today. And so that, with the ease of modern day living, putting yourself back into that natural environment is the answer. And I can explain a lot of different chronic diseases and why they're happening based on the modern environment, given that context. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but there you go.
No, you did. I think that you laid that out beautifully and brought into a whole new perspective on just questioning things. And I think that's part of where, my personal frustration comes with trust the science. We have to question everything. And I was having a conversation with my 10 and 9-year-old this morning about just questioning everything, because we've been wrong so many times. And when you build your narrative around wrong information, that can be disastrous, right? And so one more aspect I want to get into with you before we go into kind of these practical applications that you've really seen change lives is the glycocalyx. I think that is a aspect of all this that is unbelievably important, but we talk about it very rarely. And I think that probably is because there's very few that fully understand it or understand it to a degree that they can make it relatable. So how have you been able to wrap your mind around glycocalyx? What is that, and how does that tie into everything that we just talked about?
For sure. So the glycocalyx is this kind of brush border lining that lines the inside of the artery. And so it's called a glycocalyx. It's got sugar-based molecules in it, so like glucose, glycalyx, types of things. But it's thought to be this protective layer of the lining of an artery, and if you detect damage in the glycocalyx, then the artery is being damaged. What a lot of people don't understand is that, and this is relevant because when we talk about damage to the lining of artery, we're talking about progression of heart disease. We're talking about atherosclerosis, plaque formation on arteries, which is one type of heart disease. There's lots of different types of heart disease. But vascular damage is one thing that is thought to, lead to heart attack, but I have my doubts about that too. So what people don't understand necessarily is that the glycocalyx line on top of it is structured water. And they've shown this. There's studies that have shown that there's this anticoagulant gel layer, is what one study called it, on top of the glycocalyx. And it's not just on top of it. It's actually like because the glycocalyx is kind of like looking like the shag carpet in there, these little tendrils coming up. And so in between all those shag carpet, tendrils, there's structured water. Up on top of that, there's structured water. And so, well, there should be anyways, in a healthy artery, there's supposed to be structured water because the blood is about half water. And so when we energize the blood holds energy and it gets next to those hydrophilic surfaces like glycocalyx, then it will structure itself onto the lining of the artery. And they've shown this in Dr. Pollack's lab that it will in fact do this. And so that's the reason that's relevant. Well, let's back up. Let's say, so the reason that people would care about that is because we're talking about atherosclerosis. We're talking about heart disease. We're talking about the most prevalent and most dangerous, as far as being the #1 killer in the world, heart disease, right? And so something that happens on the lining of your artery is probably pretty relevant to, the lining of the artery in this disease thing that we're getting. And so I like to explain it in the context of what's called Virchow's triad. So Rudolf Virchow, back in 1856, determined that the things that dictate whether or not someone's going to develop clotting, which is what atherosclerosis is, it's clotting. People think that it's accumulation of cholesterol, and that's not what it is. If you test atherosclerosis or you analyze it, it's about 87% plus or minus 8% clotting tissue, fibrous clotting tissue, scar tissue, according to one study. When they analyzed plaque, that's what it was. That's what heart attacks are. That's what strokes are. It's clotting. Clotting happens. So we want to prevent clotting. And so back in 1856, Rudolf Virchow said, okay, the things that encourage the body to clot are when we have damage to the lining of the artery, when we have poor or stagnant or interrupted blood flow, and when we have elements of blood sticking together too much, they're coagulating too much. And so if we look at what structured water does in the lining of the artery on the glycocalyx, it has some pretty unique things. One is that one of the names for structured water is exclusion zone water. And so exclusion zone, well, it's called that because the way that structured water forms, it kind of lines up offset from each other, which makes for very little spaces between the molecules in there. And it makes it so that it's almost impenetrable. The only things that can penetrate it and get through it are very small hydrated ions of minerals, like anything potassium or lower. And so, so with that in mind, if we have healthy structured water lining the glycocalyx on the lining of the artery, nothing can touch the artery, right? It's kind of this protective layer on top of it, but we need intact, healthy, structured water, which we'll talk about how to do, I'm sure. And then so that's number one, Virchow's triad number one, is that we're protecting the lining of the artery from getting damaged, right? Which is one thing that can cause clotting if we build structured water on there. The second thing is that because structured water creates this negative next to a positive area, which is a battery, which is an energy producer, it does the work of moving fluid. And they've done this experimentally in Dr. Pollack's lab. It's all published. If you put a tube made of hydrophilic material into a tub of water and you shine infrared light on that tub of water, the water starts to move through the tube without any force acting upon it. Because structured water forms, creates the energy gradient, it pushes the water, the extra hydrogens through the tube, and it'll continue to do that forever as long as you put energy to the system. And so that is indeed the main way that blood moves in arteries. The heart pumping, well, there's not necessarily a pump. So I should say the heart contracting is not necessarily, it moves blood a little bit, but it is not the main way that blood moves in the body or any fluid moves in the body, because the lymphatic system doesn't have a pump, but it moves. Cerebral spinal fluid moves and it doesn't have a pump. So this is the way that blood is moved throughout the body. So that's Virchow's triad number two. Keep blood moving, stop it from being interrupted or stagnant or having poor blood flow. And then the third one is elements of blood clumping together. And so when you look at structured water, it will form on any hydrophilic or biological surface, because all biological surfaces are hydrophilic. And so that includes red blood cells and lipoproteins and things, elements of the blood itself. And so what they've done, and there's research published on this, is that they've shown that you can measure what's called a zeta potential, which is the net negative charge that surrounds elements of blood, like a red blood cell or a lipoprotein. And that zeta potential is representing structured water lining the red blood cell or whatever. And so if we have two things that both hold this negative charge, we know that like charges repel each other, right? So if they get too close to each other, they don't like to do that. So they're kind of attracted to the positive space of the blood because those hydrogens left over. So they're attracted. If they get too close to another negatively charged things, they kind of stay evenly spaced. And so that is Virchow's triad number three, is keep things from blood coagulating and sticking together. And you do that by creating structured water. And so you can, there's a test that all medical students know called the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, which measures how likely red blood cells are to stick together or how fast they do it. And if you build structured water, then that doesn't happen. An ESR, erythrocyte sedimentation rate, is, if you look at the research, is a huge indicator of clotting risk. whether it's heart attack, stroke, atherosclerosis, whatever, because we've lost structured water in the arteries, and that's leading to this Virchow's triad that's causing issues. And so yeah, that's clotting right there. Those three things. So if you build structured water in your arteries, you're going to prevent clotting. So when you go back to saying, like, one of my missions is that, hey, preventing heart disease is not just about diet. A bad diet will contribute in some ways, but it's about energetics. It's about biophysics. And that's what's predisposing us to heart disease. And so you look at the modern environment of humans who have removed themselves from the stimuli that build structured water in the body. They were sitting under artificial light. We're under non-native electromagnetic fields. We're eating diets that make us metabolically unhealthy, which means our mitochondria are not making structured water. Our circadian rhythms are off, which are leading to more insulin resistance, all kinds of things. We're in environments that are taking away, stealing energy from our body. And the place that takes the hit is the vascular system first. And eventually it can lead to cells, and that's cancer. And then the opposite, if you look at the studies on sunlight and infrared sauna and grounding and all these things, they're all incredibly useful for preventing heart disease. And not just the full-blown disease at the end, but the increase in blood flow. They do that tremendously. The stopping of elements of blood from clumping together. Their studies showing that infrared sauna helps the lining of the artery heal. Of course it does. It builds structured water in there and protects it. So it all makes sense. It all kind of adds up, and it's just completely ignored by our medical establishment. So.
Yeah, I mean, of course it is. There's a whole component of this. I don't know if you're familiar with Barry Ninham. His work around nanobubbles and the glycocalyx is absolutely fascinating. I have had a pretty hard time wrapping my mind around it, but the bits and pieces, I think it's another massive piece to all this. But let's go into those practical things that we can do. Again, I keep going back to Jack Kruse, but when I talked to him, I said, "What do I do? What do I do for my son?" Right, and he's like, "Go keep him away from lights and build a tan, especially on his back." I'm like, "What? What? How does that? Because when he said that, I'm just trying to process, and so as I've dove more into that, what he really said was get back in nature, right? Like be connected, be a wild human, be in the sun, build a tan, don't be in these artificial environments. And you led to that with everything that you've said. So in my estimation, I want you to agree, disagree, just tell me what you think. Our disease is going to be an energy deficiency, whether that's through toxicities or deficiencies. And I say toxicity is even as light, or deficiency even as light, right? Like depending on what we are. So if disease is deficiency, how do we start building that energy again in the context that you just laid out?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it earlier. We're trying to build redox, and what redox is just a store up of electrons, pretty much, that we need to hold so that our body can do physiology, pretty much, but also deal with toxins and things like that, and get rid of them. So there's the trend, or the saying, redox before you detox. You can't really get rid of toxins until you build up your charge. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build up our charge. We are basically big batteries. You can see mitochondria as little batteries, and you can see the structured water in our bodies that should be there is like a little battery, and it holds charge. And so if you don't have structured water, then you're going to have low charge, and I think people know what that feels like. You can have low charge. You can you just have low energy and that type of thing, and fatigue is plaguing our society. And so it's because we've taken ourselves, it's like you never plugged your phone up on its charger, right? And that's what we're doing when we live in these indoor environments, under artificial light, under non-native electromagnetic fields, eating toxic food and adding toxins to our body. We're basically stealing our charge. And so it's amazing to me that people are walking around still able to somewhat function in these environments, and that shows the resilience of the body. And so we want to plug ourselves back in. And so that's the way I kind of see it. Put yourself on your charger, and your charger is nature. It's being in that environment, because you have to think of your body as kind of, it's full of these sensory processes. We have way more than 5 senses with the ability to detect our environments, and those senses are communicating to your body the environment that we're in. And so that plays a role in, like, sensing safety of your body, but also that environment that we're in provides this energy. And like I said, we have multiple ways that we can utilize, or we can harvest energy from the environment. It's not just food. We talked about those. So you plug yourself back in. And so then the question becomes, because most people listening to this are going to be like, well, I can't just go live in nature. And I can't either. Like, I'm not just going to go sit in the woods all day or go camping the rest of my life. I can't do that and still be successful in, the modern world. So now we have to find ways that we can do these things within the context of the confines of our modern world. And so I can't spend my whole day outside. So I try, and we can take advantage of the fact that there's a grounding wire in your home, because electricity is, more modern electricity has to be grounded. That's for safety, right? So the things don't get fried in your house. And so we can take advantage of that. And there's devices you can buy that you can plug into a grounding outlet, as long as your house is truly grounded. And you can have grounding sheets or a grounding mat, those types of things. Or you could just take a copper wire and plug it into your yard, and run it through the window and close the window on the copper wire. And then you could touch the wire, or you could plug it up to a conductive surface of something with metal woven through it. And you can do that. That's a foolproof way to do it. Or you can go outside as often as you can, put your feet on the earth. And you can conduct electrons through, I'd say 5 inches or less of concrete. As long as it's directly on the ground, you'll conduct some through that. Asphalt won't do it. You can conduct on the grass. Obviously, you can conduct by touching the leaves of a tree. You can conduct with wool socks on, like natural materials. You can get some conduction through that. So that's one way. And then how do we? You can bring devices like infrared saunas or red and infrared light panels into your home. And the best is always getting outside and getting sunlight as often as you can, and building up that solar callus, so that you can take in more sunlight. It's a huge misconception that increased melanin from, like, increasing the darkness of your skin is protecting you from the sun. No, it's making it so that you can get more sun. The more melanin on your skin, the more you can turn that sunlight into electrons, into energy, and oxygen and hydrogen. And so that's what we're doing. And also eating foods that are high in DHA, because DHA on the skin cells takes that light and changes it into DC electric current, the same DC current that Thomas Edison was a fan of. It's the same thing. It's electrons. It's all about energy. So you can have these devices inside too when you can't get outside as much. You can do hot cold therapy inside, because that's what nature would have done for us. There would have been times when we were colder and we had to upregulate mechanisms to make us warmer, which is kind of called mitochondrial uncoupling. And in the summer, we're supposed to be warmer. So we can kind of have that cycle, and we can kind of mimic that indoors. Like, you can take, especially in winter, take cold showers. Your body's supposed to adapt to cold and not just live at 72 degrees all the time. We have to do these things because this is how our physiology was made to work. And if we don't make it work, like do something hard, then it never adapts. We never get the resilience that we need to create health. And we end up breaking down. We end up losing energy. So we can also, food is a big one. Food, if you eat a diet that's creating poor metabolic health, then you are contributing to the likelihood that you can get atherosclerosis and many other diseases, because you're creating insulin resistance. And that means that your body can't build and repair as well. So if we do get damage to something like the lining of the artery, it can't repair itself. And the body is forced to do something else, which is use clotting material, which does involve cholesterol, but it's not caused by cholesterol, to kind of patch that up. And that's what we think of as atherosclerosis. And so all these different things about the context of our modern world, you start to learn about it and you realize, man, we're doing all the wrong things. No wonder we're sick. And so you put yourself back into the right things and you get well. And so I'll just give a kind of a short story just to show the impact of this. So after I had the heart attack, they went in, they placed a stent, which, they may or may not have had to place a stent, I could argue, but regardless, they saved my life. I'm grateful, I'm here. And that's the way I look at it. But to do that, they had to do a heart cath where they went into the artery in my leg. And when they were done with the heart cath, they sealed it up with a device called an angioseal. And that device interrupted blood flow going to my leg. And I developed atherosclerosis in the the lower part of my thigh, in the femoral artery, the distal femoral artery. And so that was restricting blood flow to my lower leg. And I started to notice that I definitely couldn't run. I couldn't play soccer. Snowboarding was hard. Even walking fast through the airport, my leg would hurt because I wasn't getting blood to my lower leg. If I was just sitting here, it was fine. And so eventually figured it out. They did the testing, and that part of the artery in my leg was 75 to 99% blocked with plaque, with atherosclerosis. And so they said, well, obviously you can't do some of the things you like to do, but it's not interfering with your day-to-day life. So we don't want to mess with it because they usually get worse when we mess with them. And so the only thing that I did different after that, because the device is still in there, I've asked them to take it out and nobody will do it. I can't find anybody that will do it. And the reason they use those things is because you can sit up faster. Like if I had that in there, didn't have that in there, I have to lay on my back for like 36 to 48 hours or something like that. And for people who are adrenally healthy, laying there that long, there's increased risk of clotting and that kind of stuff. So they use the device so that you can sit up within 12 hours, but then it caused this thing. And so my diet stayed the same: low carb, animal-based diet, at times completely carnivore, but not all the time. My stress stayed the same. Unfortunately, it maybe even got worse at some points. My cholesterol stayed the same. My cholesterol is pretty elevated because I'm what's called a lean mass hyperresponder, that Dave Feldman has talked about. And so it stayed elevated. And during this process, the only things that I did different were I used infrared sauna a ton, got as much sunlight as I could, started grounding, and I set my circadian rhythm. Those are the four main things that I did differently. Everything else stayed the same. And a year later, I went back and the testing showed that it was only 50% blocked, and it was improved. And at the time, the physician told me, well, we can't say that it's better because we just don't see these things get better. And I was like, well, the testing just said it was better. And so, yeah, they actually came in and did the test twice. The lady who did the test got the result, went out of the room, talked to the doctor, came back, we're going to do it again. And it was still 50% blocked. A year later, it came back, it was normal. The artery was completely normal. And just this past May, I went back for the second time. So for the last 2 years, it's been normal. And I want to point out to people, my LDL cholesterol is way above what people say it should be and what the people say causes atherosclerosis. And I reversed atherosclerosis in my leg with it being that high, because it has nothing to do with atherosclerosis, in my opinion. And so I did it by creating health in my arteries through building structured water, doing these things. That's what I added. It's what I did the most of. And I will always keep doing them. And so that's the power of these things. I'm not just sitting here saying it because I read some research or something like that. Like I've lived it. I've done it. I've healed my heart. I've healed my artery in a way that doctors tell me that couldn't happen unless I took their medications, and I didn't take any. So, yeah.
Beautiful story. It's wonderful. I think that just goes to show how important that connection is. One thing on the heart before we jump off here is Lander, my son. He received doxorubicin, so that's the red devil chemotherapy that is really common, like breast cancer, and it's known to damage the heart. So we still have to have echoes, right? And so I have the best I can tell, the reason that they say it damages the heart is it destroys the mitochondria around the valve. But my hope is that through exactly what you just said, and also the aspect of building melanin, like deep in the tissues, the cardiac plexus is loaded with melanin. So do you think that we can overcome those side effects of something that's as strong of a chemotherapy by doing things as right as possible?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I'm not just going to make blanket statements that yes, everybody can do it, but there's always something more than what Western medicine tells you is possible. And I truly believe that with all the things I've seen now, in myself and with other people. But yeah, so if you think about it, like, so the reason that that's relevant for your son is that those things could cause damage to the heart tissue itself, the mitochondria and then the heart tissue. And then, so that's what predisposes you to heart failure, right? That just damages the heart tissue. And they think that the heart is this pressure propulsion pump that's forcefully pumping blood around the body. And that's not what it's doing. It's doing other things. There's other roles of the heart, and the blood is moving by those fourth phase water mechanisms in the arteries. And so if you look at the research on infrared light exposure, infrared sauna, and, preventing and correcting heart failure, it's absolutely phenomenal. And so that's the play there, is get as much infrared exposure as you can. And so for the most people, just, being outside as often as possible as well. But, for some who are predisposed, it may take a more concentrated dose. And that's why infrared saunas are useful. We can get a concentrated dose. We can do it in a controlled way, in a concentrated way. And so that's huge there. But, and the other concern is clotting, because, if the heart starts to fail, then the blood's not moving through things as well. It can pool up, it can get stagnant, and that increases risk of clotting. And so, again, the way we prevent clotting is we build the structured water. We talked about that, and that just helps prevent everything. Is it foolproof? Probably not. Nothing's foolproof, but it gives you the best chance of that. And then if you look at what, these things have done, to me, they create scar tissue. In like when and we know that scar tissue is less conductive. That's why people who have heart attacks and damage to their heart tissue, they don't conduct the signal from the heart to contract as well. An electrical signal that comes through there. And scar tissue is it's basically collagen proteins that are too tightly packed together. Like when they get damaged, they become too tightly packed together. And when they're that tightly packed, structured water can't form on them. And the structured water is what makes them conductive of electricity. And so if there's scar tissue, we want to try and break it up, which that's hard to do in heart tissue because it's hard to get in there and kind of break it up. Like you can a superficial muscle, you can get in there and you can break it up. But I just posted a study recently talking about how light can transduce into the heart. And there's studies that show that people who have more infrared light exposure throughout their lifetime have less scar tissue in general in their body. And so we know that it can, again, transduce to the heart. I mean, the heart's fairly superficial there, depending on how big your pecs are, I guess. But, it can get into there. And so that's the play, again, is we get the infrared light to the heart. It could be a red light panel with near infrared in it. It could be infrared sauna. It could be sunlight. That's the most natural way, but it's huge. I mean, light is signaling. It's telling your body what to do. It's structuring water in your body. It's building your charge. It's giving you information. And we know that it's information because, all these electromagnetic signals that we get today, wireless and cell phones and all that kind of stuff, that's carrying information. We know that. I can pick up my phone, I can call you. It's carrying information. And that's all that stuff is on the electromagnetic spectrum of light. That's what it's on. So the visible light is on the same spectrum as all those electromagnetic signals. So we know that light is information. It's carrying information. Our body's trying to interpret it, give it the right information, which the only light information that we would have had on this earth was that from the sun, which is UV through infrared. Do that or have ways that we mimic that with some modern technologies, and we give ourselves the best chance for sure.
Love it. Love that answer. Well, Dr. Stephen Hussey, give us all the plugs. Where can we send people to find you? And of course, get that book. Your book's, great job, brother. Did a killer job on that. But yeah, give us all the plugs.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. I hope that it helps people, and that's the reason I wrote it. So if it's helping people, then it's doing its job. My website is resourceyourhealth.com. and my blog is on there. My books are on there, and I run my health consulting through there. People can consult with me. I just help people manage complex chronic conditions. My books are on Amazon. The Heart book is also, if you don't want to use Amazon, you can use go to the publisher's website, which is Chelsea Green Publishing. And then I'm on social media. My handle is just Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey. People can reach out to me there, or I post a lot of content for free on there. So yeah. And then I have a new book coming up. Hopefully it's out soon. This one's about pain, where I talk about all these kind of quantum or biophysics aspects of the body, and how we should be approaching pain and the chronic pain epidemic that we're having. So yeah.
Love it. We'll have to do a follow-up on the pain, but man, thank you so much for taking the time and your work, and taking that pain and turning it into power to help other people, buddy. So appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us in the Sowing Prosperity mission. If you like this content, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Be sure to check out sowingprosperity.com. Sign up for the email. We've got so much more work to do.